Good afternoon, everyone. This is Alison Van Inenham, and we will get started with this webinar in just a minute or two. So welcome and thanks for joining us on our Friday afternoon environmental impacts of animal ag. And we'll look forward to the poll results. Okay, so it looks like we have closed the poll. And so the answer to the first question, according to the paper that we were reviewing this week, is between 50 and 70% of vitamin B12 is provided by the dairy industry in the US. Percentage of dietary protein provided by dairy is 20%, so majority got that one right. Typical protein percentage of whole milk, according to what I could find, was somewhere between 3 to 4 is what seems to be the majority here. I think it's 8 grams in, I think I've got that right, in whole milk, and it would not differ in skim milk because skim milk differs in fat but not protein. So actually the number I have written down is between 2 and 3 is what I saw. And DS is something that's going to be talked about maybe today, is actually, yes, the digestible indispensable amino acid score, but it's actually also all of the above. It's a Bulgarian disc jockey in addition, and a village and rural community in the Tias region of Senegal. Well, actually, it's not none of the above, all of the above. But anyway, so we are going to speak a little bit about that. So thanks for playing along with that. I'm going to start to introduce our speaker today. So today, Robin White is joining us. She's an associate professor in the Department of Animal and Poultry Sciences at Virginia Tech. She has a PhD in mathematical modeling and sustainable agricultural systems from Washington State University, and trained as an animal nutritionist while serving as a postdoctoral scholar for the National Animal Nutrition Program, which is a national research support project funded through the USDA. At Virginia Tech, Robin teaches courses in animal nutrition, equine nutrition, ruminant nutrition, and equine industry, current issues in animal sciences, and precision technologies. She also runs a research program which centers on the nexus of livestock, technology, and the environment. And so without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Robin White to talk to us about balancing the environmental impacts and nutritional supplies from dairy products in the US. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really pleased to share some of our work with you all. This is a talk that will focus on kind of the high-level issues that are emerging in this space right now. And I always struggle sometimes with these talk requests because usually they center around a paper that we've published, and the work on that paper was done, a couple of years ago at this point, and it sits in the publication process for a year or so. And then by the time it's actually out to the public, the conversation has really evolved. And so in this talk, I'm really focusing on where our conversations are right now regarding this idea of balance within food systems, specifically related to human nutritional supplies and environmental impacts. And we'll tailor this discussion, of course, to dairy products in the US. But as most of us are aware, the discussion is really at the global scale. So we'll talk today a little bit about what the current discussion is around food systems and who's involved in that discussion and how that discussion is evolving, because the discussion of food systems becomes very influential in understanding the role of individual commodities or foods in trying to meet our global challenges. We'll then transition into some specific conversations about how to use this evolving understanding of food systems to evaluate the role of dairy. And that flows into a discussion about this concept of balance within food systems, and 3 critical tenets that we can use to evaluate the balance of environmental and nutritional objectives of food systems. And we'll finish up with my thoughts on some future perspectives and where the industry should be heading, given this context of conversation occurring at the national and international scales. So it's no secret to anyone that we are in this global food challenge that is working on a timescale of a couple of decades. And we are evolving to call this a global food crisis, though I think that that's rather emotive language. Nevertheless, we are in a situation where the global population is increasing. Our availability of resources, land and water specifically, for the production of agricultural products is limited already. And I understand that that's a major challenge in the California context, but certainly an evolving challenge in the context of many agricultural systems around the world. And in addition to needing to find ways to increase the total quantity of food from a smaller or non-existent resource base, we also are faced with the challenge of changing climate. And that is really a circular issue where livestock, of course, contribute to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions, but are also affected by climate change. And that impact of climate change and climate variability on livestock production becomes more pronounced when we consider it in the context of limited availability of resources. Now, as this conversation about this emerging food challenge has evolved over the last decade, it's really expanded to also include discussion of the equity and accessibility challenges associated with different food systems, specifically related to affordability and access to healthy foods. So addressing all of these challenges simultaneously is an international priority that's been expunged by a number of groups, perhaps most notably through the UN Sustainability or Sustainable Development Goals, which at this point, probably most folks are fairly familiar with these goals. And it's quite clear that agriculture and food production in general contribute to the vast majority of these directly and all of them indirectly. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals are really a hot topic in the past couple of months and will continue to be a hot topic over the next several months because of the UN World Food Systems Summit 2021 and the associated dialogues that are ongoing regarding the content of this summit. So the general objectives of the summit are to generate significant action toward the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, raising awareness about reforming our food systems and how that can be a tool to try and work toward these sustainable development goals. That includes specific language related to developing principles to guide food system change and creating a system of follow-up to drive action and progress. So, you know, the a priori assumption that's demonstrated by these goals is that our current food system will fail to meet the needs of this, you know, changing population and changing resource base, and that food system change is required to be able to move toward our sustainable development goals. So, you know, keeping that in mind, the other important thing about that's revealed really by kind of text analysis of these goals is, as with most things kind of driven by the UN, the language here is very much focused on creating actionable change, right? They actually have an entire objective related to a system of follow-up to drive action and progress. So whereas the last decade or so of discussion around food systems and the global food challenge has really focused on discussion about that challenge and highlighting the fact that it's going to be an issue and that maybe that, you know, there's different potential solutions. This summit is really demonstrating kind of a pivot point where we're moving toward actions to try and address the challenge associated with the global food system. So what is a food system, right? In all of this work that's gone into the UN Food Summit and the associated dialogues, there's a number of documents that are quite nice. I mean, they're really well put together to describe a lot of these base discussion points. So this is the evolving definition of a food system as provided by the UN. So they embrace the entire range of actors, interlinked value-added activities, including production, aggregation, processing, distribution, consumption, disposal of food products that originate from ag, forestry, fisheries, food industries, and the broader economic, societal, and natural environments in which they're embedded. And I do love this definition because it is really all-encompassing and highlights the fact that over the last couple of decades of research on this food system challenge, we've really gotten the point across that changes in the food system are not, they don't just stay within the food system. They have reverberations throughout the entirety of society. And so those kind of collateral impacts need to be considered when we talk about food system design or food system change. Now, they've also refined the definition of a sustainable food system, and it's a little bit more explicit than what we're used to in our USDA definition, which traditionally is centered on social, economic, and environmental bases and our ability to provide for tomorrow in a manner that doesn't, provide for today in a manner that doesn't impede our ability to provide for tomorrow. So this updated definition includes specific language about food security and nutrition and the cultural value of food. And oftentimes those concepts in our kind of historical USDA definition get folded into that social element. But I would say the social aspect has always been the one that's least clearly defined. And so explicitly pulling out these objectives of food security, nutrition, and the cultural value of food, in addition to things like, the social value of farming, worker welfare, consumer perception of food products, helps to better really encompass what a truly sustainable food system, what it might look like. The thing I really love about the kind of the context that the UN documents provide is they propose these two different lenses through which we can view food systems. And it's through these lenses that we really see a lot of the current disparities within the scientific literature. And so, notably in this ongoing discussion about the role of animal products, many studies kind of ask the question of how would we design a food system to meet human needs or environmental objectives. And they don't ask the question of what our current food system looks like and what it provides. Versus like some of the work that our group has done, including the dairy paper referenced here, takes kind of the opposite approach. It looks at what our agricultural system provides and how the different mechanisms or players within that system reveal opportunities to work toward the different goals that we might have. So these are two different ways of asking the same question. And really, the lovely thing about these documents is it points out the fact that both strategies have some limitations. So this kind of positive lens where we're looking at the current system and our understanding of opportunity is really grounded within what that current system looks like, means that we can miss opportunities by imagining drastically different systems. Versus this approach where we are kind of setting objectives and asking how we could kind of, from a brand new standpoint, synthesize a system that works toward those objectives, it can be unrealistic. And our best opportunity to define a sustainable food system and move toward that within a fairly short time frame is really by integrating these types of approaches. So using both a positive and a normative lens to evaluate food systems and food system questions. So that's what we're going to try to do in this discussion today. And we'll start by kind of working into a discussion about dairy in the food system. So if we take this kind of approach of looking at what the system looks like today, this is some summary data from the Levy paper. And the numbers across the top are just rough guidelines, right? So the dairy industry takes something like 85 million tons of feed, feeds it to 9 million cattle, produces something like 150 million tons of manure, 100 million tons of milk, and 0.6% of the US greenhouse gas emission profile. So if we look at just those numbers, we can already start to talk about things like balance and compromise within the system. Is 100 million tons of dairy product worth 0.6% of greenhouse gas emissions? And that's kind of the proverbial question, right? Now, if we look at the entire profile of what's provided by the dairy industry, to me, that's a lot more influential in understanding and kind of characterizing or conceptualizing the role of dairy products in our society. Because when you start talking on the scale of millions, numbers become semi-imaginary, right? It's very challenging for me to really understand what the value of our 9 million cattle is. But if we express the numbers in terms of, the percent of total human edible nutrients supplied from the dairy industry, it can be a little bit more interpretable. So the dairy industry is supplying something like 10% of the energy available for consumption in the US, about 20% of the protein, as you already highlighted on your quiz. But it's really not in energy and protein that dairy products have their most important roles. And so again, if we're viewing the way the system works currently, evaluating these types of metrics can highlight where dairy's playing a really important role in providing consumable foods for our human population. Those types of consumable foods consumable nutrients that are really essential include things like calcium, right? Over 70% of our domestic supplies of calcium are coming from the dairy industry. Vitamin A and vitamin D, right? 40 and 50+% of our supplies are coming from dairy. Same thing with riboflavin, nearly 50%, and vitamin B12, right up there above 50%. So it's really in provision of some of these really important minerals and vitamins where we can highlight a very critical role of the dairy industry in supplying quantities of human edible nutrients. Now, if we think about, again, this concept of kind of balance, then we're stuck with this constant discussion about whether the nutritional benefits in terms of things like calcium, vitamin D, vitamin A, choline, B12, alpha-linoleic acid, and amino acids, which are all in very high supply from dairy products, whether that degree of supply is worth the environmental expense that we pay for it. And that expense that's talked about most commonly is, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions, that roughly 0.6% of US emissions highlighted on the previous slide, but also in the context of our other environmental impacts. So things like water use, land use, and then water quality in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus emissions into our waterways. And this type of evaluation that's based on how the system currently looks, it doesn't really give us tools to try and discuss the relative importance of these products, not in a quantitative way, right? We're stuck with kind of qualitative statements like the nutritional benefit is probably worth the environmental impact. But whether it's worth it to different audiences is really worth considering. So, this other approach, we already have the different goals that we're working toward established. And so we don't need to go through this exercise of thinking about what those goals are, right? The UN's already done that for us. We need to be working toward food security. We need to be working toward a nutritious supply of food. We need to be safeguarding economic, social, cultural, and environmental bases of our food production system. And we need to do this in a manner today that doesn't impede our ability to work in the future. So when we think about those goals individually, this is where we start to really hear discussion deviating between developed and developing countries. And it doesn't necessarily have to deviate. For example, if we look at some recent data, food insecurity affects 1 in 8 households in the US. Food security is not just a challenge associated with developing countries. It affects both our urban and our rural populations. And there's a fascinating explosion of research over the past really 5 years that explores this concept of food deserts and food swamps within our kind of food supply landscape in the United States, and how those food deserts and food swamps are correlated with human health outcomes. And definitely the prevailing summary of that literature certainly seems to be that it's more about the accessibility of unhealthy foods, I suppose, than it is about the lack of accessibility of healthy foods. So that presents a pretty important, honestly, psychological challenge that we need to address as a society. But within the context of kind of this food security question and the dairy industry, this is a nice summary paper that highlights the different strategies that individuals, households, communities, and policy systems employ when faced with the challenge of food insecurity. And I'm highlighting here, some of those challenges, or excuse me, those strategies, which can be relevant for dairy production, right, or dairy products, as it were. Right? So dairy products provide a fairly low cost source of food. And they can be a way that people can try and save money at the store while still purchasing a fairly healthy product. If you look at some of the strategies we use in livestock ration formulation, actually, like looking at the cost per unit of calcium or the cost per unit of energy, dairy products actually work out quite favorably. And we'll talk more about that balance question in a little bit. Dairy products are also a nice alternative where they are offered actually in many fast food restaurants, where perhaps you can use that as a drink as opposed to things like less healthy alternatives. But there's also some places in terms of how people cope with food security where dairy is not doing well. And so as an example, most of this centers around how we produce dairy and whether you can do so in a self-sufficient manner, right? We probably do not want people to be producing their own dairy products. There's probably some food safety concerns associated with that. Just like we probably don't want people to be working toward eating expired or spoiled dairy products. Again, there's food safety concerns there. Although we do have pasteurization technologies, which would allow people to kind of develop supplies or stashes of dairy products, those are not widely used within the US. And so they probably don't present a logical kind of tool or technology that we could leverage within the dairy industry to address how dairy products can be a part of this food security solution, at least not as they're presently employed. So if we think about this goal, this food security goal, how can dairy contribute to improving food security? There's some places where we have opportunities for improvement. And so, this concept of refrigeration and shelf life stability becomes an important one for dairy products. How can we start to work with the US population to be a little bit more amenable to, UHT pasteurization technologies and things, so that we can move away from the need for refrigeration for dairy products? cost is a place where we have a lot of advantages. Again, if you look at the cost per unit nutrient of dairy products versus many other sources of similar vitamins and minerals, they become a very economical way to get these nutrients into the human diet. And then we also have this challenge, of course, related to the refrigeration challenge that dairy is a perishable product, and there are food safety concerns when we start to move away from good handling practices. So working to address some of these distribution and storage challenges associated with dairy products while maintaining a low cost can be one strategy where the dairy industry can continue to work toward this goal of improving food security within our US context. Now, if we think about the goal of nutrition, the UN documents also go so far as to try and they have an entire document trying to define what a healthy diet is. And it's really tremendously well written, and I highly recommend it. If nothing else, just a nice way to think through the tremendous challenges that human nutrition researchers have. We really have it good as livestock nutrition researchers. We have a much easier job than folks that work with humans. So this document spends a lot of time talking about the challenges associated with defining a healthy diet, because we don't have a lot of intervention-based research in human nutrition. A lot of it becomes epidemiological research, which is subject to the quantitative techniques that are used to summarize that type of data and the limitations of those techniques. So, they discuss a lot of those challenges and really do their best to define a healthy diet. And it becomes much like the definition of a food system in that it becomes somewhat all-encompassing. So they define a healthy diet as something that is health promoting and disease preventing, noting that these are two very different goals. We can promote health while still fail to prevent diseases. And we can prevent diseases while failing to promote health. They also talk about this idea of providing adequate supplies of energy and nutrients without providing excess, and highlight the fact that the value of a diet or the value of a food specifically is very context dependent, right? And so this set of images that I've got here is really illustrating. This is actually the example they use in this document. It is a milk example, which I think is really pertinent to the discussion today. That whole milk may be a perfect source of high quality energy, protein, digestible amino acids, and bioavailable vitamins and minerals for a growing child. But that same food, whole milk, may not be a great choice for the diet of an obese adult. And of course, it really depends on what other food options those folks have access to, their broader socioeconomic context. And so this idea of defining the healthfulness of foods, again, really needs to be within the context of almost an individual human's diet. So if we think about dairy in this context of trying to define nutritious foods, dairy can be viewed as a high source of energy, which is a good thing for those physiological populations which need higher energy diets. But of course, that can be a challenge for those sedentary populations or those with pre-existing health conditions. Calcium, as we illustrated in kind of the other assessment, through that other lens, is supplied in tremendous quantities in dairy products. And for a long time, that's been a part of the calcium story, is the importance of consuming milk. And so it's really not new information that milk is a tremendous source of calcium and one that should be leveraged as a part of healthy diets. Now, the calcium requirement for different physiological stages of human production, if you will, differs quite tremendously. And so again, it needs to be context specific for those individual populations where we really need to be working additional calcium into the diet to maintain health. Of course, as we illustrated again in the previous, the Levy paper, milk is a critical source of a number of different vitamins and complementary to many of our fruits and veg sources. And we'll highlight that in just a bit here. But, as much like the energy conversation, dairy products, the fatty acid composition in them can be a challenge if we are already in a situation where we need to be limiting energy consumption. And so, although there's nutritional benefits to dairy products, there's also some challenges, particularly for populations that need to be nutrient restricted. Our third goal, among other things, looks at safeguarding the environment, right? And this is the fairly well-cited work from Rockstrom in 2009, which talks about the planetary boundaries. And at, over a decade ago, we were already exceeding or nearly exceeding our planetary boundaries for biogeochemical nitrogen and phosphorus flows, for biodiversity loss, and for climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And so working toward these different environmental objectives becomes the goal of this aspect of food sustainability. And, for today, I'm not going to talk too much about the nitrogen and phosphorus issues or biodiversity loss. We'll focus predominantly on climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, because that's where a lot of the discussion surrounding animal agriculture has emphasized. So if we think about dairy and ruminants specifically and greenhouse gas emissions and their effect on global warming, there was an update in our discussion on the contributions of different greenhouse gas emissions to global warming from Kane and colleagues in 2019, which highlighted the fact that mitigating methane emissions has a major impact on global warming potential, much more so than mitigating CO2 emissions. And so, in this figure, it is highlighting the fact that because methane is short-lived in the atmosphere, in a situation where we have constant emissions of methane, there's no new warming associated with that methane, though there is new warming associated with CO2 if it was in constant emission. And if we're in a situation where we're diminishing emissions of methane in comparison to diminishing emissions of CO2, it's not until we have zero emissions of CO2 do we flatline the warming associated with that. Whereas our warming associated with methane is proportional. So it actually decreases immediately in response to the falling emissions. And so that's this updated understanding of our global warming potentials we've started to leverage it in kind of a renewed effort to work toward mitigating methane emissions from ruminant animals. So this is some work focused on sheep, but the same principle applies to most ruminant animals, that if we are to apply this radiative forcing based carbon footprint and look at the potential to reduce methane over time, the impact of doing something like this in the Australian meat sheep sector ends up being fairly measurable in terms of the global warming potential impact. So this highlights the fact that ruminant animals and dairy animals, by virtue of being ruminants, become a really important part of our climate change solution. Now, if we look at greenhouse gas emissions of dairy cattle in the US, these are estimated values from FAO. Between 1960 and the present, we have a period where there's fairly pronounced and rapid decrease in emissions, which is largely associated with the depopulation of the dairy herd that's occurring over that time as we start to really intensively genetically select these animals for improved milk production and can get away with having smaller herd sizes. But over the last several decades, we've had fairly constant emissions in that context. And so there's a number of strategies and technologies, many of which are being actively researched at UC Davis. And I'll leave those to the discussion of the experts. But I would just advocate that we need to start thinking as an industry about how we can implement those technologies over the next 10 years to really achieve a similar type of change as we saw between like 1960 and 1970 in a perfect world. So we're doing quite well for having fairly flatlined emissions while continuing to dramatically increase the supplies of dairy products. But I would challenge the industry, and definitely the industry has challenged itself through its pledge to move toward carbon neutrality, that there's a lot we can do to continue maybe another stair step in this trend. Now, if we kind of take a summary there of what this looks like, dairy offers a low-cost food that's a great source of calcium and vitamins, and it has this great opportunity for reducing global warming potentials. But we still have this trade-off revealed through this kind of alternative goals-based approach, where dairy has some challenges with regard to accessibility and food safety, to energy and fat content, and of course it does contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So that one kind of ends up both a positive and a negative. So we're still left with this question of how do we work toward a balance of these different goals? And so we'll talk a little bit about this concept of balance in food systems, and I'll advocate this is largely my thoughts on this. And I think that there's really three things that we need to consider for balance in food systems. And that's the complexity of food sources as sources of nutrients, the complementarity of different food sources, and the importance of cooperation or kind of trade-offs within evaluating different food sources. So if we think about complexity, this is some data that we've adapted from FAO Stat, and it looks at the proportion of different minerals, zinc, selenium, potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, etc., coming from different food types in different food systems around the world. So Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, etc. And I've just selected the mineral panel. This graph also has energy, protein, amino acids, vitamins. But I love the mineral panel because it's so colorful, right? It's really a mosaic of the food system, highlighting the fact that these different food types become really important contributors to mineral supplies. And the relative importance of them tends to differ by location, right? Those sources in Africa are much more diverse than they are in North America, as an example. And this level of complexity within our food system has evolved for a reason. And I think that we need to maintain an understanding that simplex food systems are probably not, they look nice on paper, and they're quite clean from a scientific or a clinical perspective. But maintaining the complexity within the system is likely a very important objective. Complementarity also becomes an interesting concept. So this is, some data that we've adapted from the USDA Foods List. And it's looking at the kilos of feed that would need to be kilos of food, because we're talking about human consumption here, that would need to be consumed to meet the calcium requirement of an average adult if we were consuming, artichokes, asparagus, beans, etc., all the way through till milk is our last value here at the end. So you can see, to consume your daily requirement of calcium from milk exclusively as a source, you'd need to be consuming almost a kilo of milk, which is a tremendous amount. Nevertheless, if we look at what that level of consumption would provide in terms of some of our other nutrients, consuming a kilo of milk would meet 30% of your daily energy requirement, versus, some of these other foods, consuming the level needed to meet that calcium equivalent would provide nearly the entirety of your energy requirement, as an example. And then we look at the same thing for phosphorus and riboflavin. And so you can meet the entirety of your riboflavin requirement every day if you're also meeting your calcium requirement for milk while only consuming 30% of your energy requirement. And, this is phosphorus over here, riboflavin's over here, but it's the same story. You can consume sufficient quantities to meet your requirement. And dairy is really the only food, or one of the only foods for which that's the case. There's a few others in there, but it provides a nice way of looking at the fact that an individual food needs to be viewed more than for just its contribution of a single nutrient, right? It needs to be viewed in its context of providing a low energy contribution of that nutrient and complementary other nutrient profiles. And milk has kind of a nice story there with things like calcium, phosphorus, and some of our vitamins. The other thing that I think is really important to talk about within this discussion of balance within food systems is compromise. So this is a heat map showing the correlation between, in this first section, the production of different food products as a proportion of the total production of individual countries. And then in the next kind of section, the relative contribution of different nutrients relative to the society's requirement. And in the last two lines, the per capita environmental impacts of the food production system. So this large red block basically tells you that supply of nutrients, those populations that do a better job of supplying energy for their population are also doing a better job of supplying protein and other nutrients. If we look at our different food products, a lot of those tend to be fairly negatively correlated with one another, reflecting trade-offs among the food system. And perhaps most importantly, we can look at how they relate to environmental impacts. And there are some products that are positively correlated with environmental impacts, of which milk is one. But the correlation with greenhouse gas emissions is not very consistent with the correlation with per capita water use from the agricultural system. So even within the concept of environmental impact, there are important trade-offs. I should say this heat map is generated from individual country data downloaded from FAO. And so it reflects this averaging phenomenon across different countries. And consistently, we see that there are important relationships with environmental impact, but of course, there are also important relationships with nutrient supply. So note, several of these lines where we have, a darker red box for environmental impact also have darker red boxes for the different provision of nutrients, meaning that food systems with higher milk production may have higher greenhouse gas emissions, but they're also doing a better job of meeting their country's requirements for energy and different nutrients. And so it really underscores this idea that there is compromise within the food production system, specifically when we talk about these nutritional and environmental goals. So it becomes a balancing act. In talking about our objectives related to food security, to nutrition, to the environment, and considering this idea of the complexity of the system, the complementarity of different foods within the system, and the need to compromise between some of these goals. And, I hate to say it, but it does become a question of kind of social economics. There's no common currency or metric that we can use to value environmental impacts and human nutritional benefits associated with foods. And that means that we do kind of end up subject to these value-based comparisons. And so working toward strategies where we can represent this multifaceted nature of food, the fact that it's not just about good supplies of one nutrient or multiple nutrients, it's about the whole food profile of all nutrients and environmental impacts, is really, I think, an important direction moving forward. Right, so I'll go through the dairy perspectives quickly because I think I'm seeing a number of questions pop up, and I want to make sure that we've got some time for those. If we kind of combined what we can learn from this positive and normative assessment of how dairy fits within the food system, we have some opportunities to change the way that we store and distribute products to work toward this goal of improving food security. We have some opportunities to modulate the composition of our products to try and work toward perhaps reduced energy composition or altered fatty acid composition, and enhanced supplies of the things that we are doing a good job of providing, our vitamins and minerals. We have a need and a great opportunity to be part of the success story associated with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and attempting to curb some of the impacts of global warming, and can do so in the ruminant industries through mitigating methane. And I believe that that's probably going to be a large discussion next week. So I won't go into that in any degree of detail and leave it for the experts. But it's about more than just these kind of little fixes. We also need to continue focusing on how to improve the value chain and how to improve our production system, including continuing to genetically select animals in a manner that works toward animal health, animal well-being, animal productivity, and reproductive efficiency. We need to get our animals bred, which is, of course, a challenge within the dairy industry. And we need to continue to support high production of milk. We're seeing at the global scale a lot of discussion around moving towards circular food systems. And I think that's where we're going to have a lot of opportunity for interesting research within the dairy nutrition area, how we can continue to support the elite level of milk production achieved by these animals through this idea of circular food systems, feeding food waste to animals, feeding exclusively non-human edible product. And there's already a lot of examples within the US of some systems that have, at the research level and at the production level, worked toward that goal of feeding zero human edible product. And I think that will continue to be a trend moving forward, given the human nutritional benefit and the environmental benefit of moving toward a zero waste system. So that's my evolving discussion about the food system and the role of dairy in it. When we think about food system, there's these global interest in trying to formalize efforts and approaches to move toward actual actionable change in the food system. And we need to keep our finger on the pulse there so that we're part of the discussion. Dairy systems have strengths and weaknesses when we look through both environmental and nutritional lenses, and we need to be transparent about those strengths and weaknesses so that we can figure out what role we do play in food systems and how to move forward. These concepts of food system complexity and food complementarity and the compromise between objectives within food systems are unavoidable when we're evaluating systems. And moving forward, we have a tremendous amount of opportunity to continue the good work that the dairy industry is doing to have a really important impact toward this idea of actionable change for improved food security. So with that, I'm happy to try and address any comments or questions you might have. And if we don't get to them today, please feel free to email me. Yeah.
Thanks, Robin. We do have some questions that have been entered into our question box, so I'll just go ahead and read them to you. There's one is a particular question from Frank, and that is, in your opinion, is net zero carbon achievable, or should we focus on carbon neutrality instead?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Achievable is
Could you maybe differentiate between net zero carbon and carbon neutrality for those that aren't in this lingo?
Yeah, and Frank is welcome to correct me if I'm misunderstanding, because he would definitely be the expert there. But net net zero.
Oh, excuse me, I misread it. It's net zero carbon versus climate neutrality. Sorry, Frank. Climate neutrality, not carbon neutrality.
Yeah, so net zero emissions would be working toward this idea that we have offsetting sinks and sources, versus climate neutral would be we are not contributing to warming. I think it's much more achievable to work around this idea of a climate neutral system. There's been a tremendous amount of advancement in our understanding of carbon sinks and quantification of those. But I think there's still a fair amount of disagreement among the scientific literature about the right way to go about that and the right timescales to consider. And so I struggle with how we would define really like the operational parameters around carbon neutral system, though I know that the industry is kind of working toward that type of definition. Yeah, I think anything is achievable. It's just how big a price are people going to be willing to pay for it, and that's where I struggle a little bit. I'm not sure that the U.S. public is ready to fork over that cost.
Okay.
That's your question.
So there's another one here from Emmaus. Which do you think would be the best metric for assessing environmental impact of animal source foods? So far, a combination of 6 or 15 nutrients seems to be fair instead of proteins or calories.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's a bit of work that's going on trying to use some of these nutritive indices and looking at, environmental impact per unit of nutrient indice. The UN document actually does a nice job of highlighting some of the trade-offs and challenges associated with those nutrient indices. And I'm not entirely sure that the human nutrition community has consolidated on what a nutritious food profile would look like, which means it's really hard to think about how you would incorporate that into an environmental metric. I actually am really intrigued with the idea of using better data analytics techniques to address that question, to look at dimensionality reduction rather than trying to work toward kind of human-informed indices. And so we've got some work that's kind of in the early stages, trying to leverage that as a technique. I think that the preliminary stuff looks kind of promising, but it requires people to be willing to conceptualize something more than a single number, which seems to be, it's easy in principle, but it seems to be a major hurdle to get over. Folks really want to boil this conversation down to here's the carbon number relative to nutrients. And I don't really believe in that degree of simplicity.
This one's an interesting one. So arguably there is no such thing as a food system per se, but it's a hugely diverse set of markets that have evolved from countless individual and public choices. Are you advocating some kind of central planning focused on food production and distribution? And if so, who gets to decide?
This has always been my question around this goal-focused approach. Because to me, that's exactly what's implied by the goal-focused approach, that we're going to sit around a table, we've come up with our goals, we're going to figure out the best way to work toward those goals, and then it is presumably the job of state and local governments. There's folks that advocate it's the job of food consumers to push agricultural systems toward whatever that perceived ideal is. And to me, that's not at all how the world works. We have an agricultural system that has evolved because of complex biophysical, socioeconomic pressures toward its current status. And I think it's probably a much more efficient strategy to look at the strengths and weaknesses of that agricultural system and identify ways within each industry to work toward these broader global goals, rather than working towards shifting the agricultural supplies of products. The other complex thing about that is that a lot of times when we have these discussions, we're talking specifically about food. Humans are going to change demand for food, which will then drive agricultural systems change. And if you look at the data, there's no evidence that that's how agricultural systems react to changes in food demand. In the US, for example, our cereal grain production, less than 20% of it is going to human food consumption. So if you think about just the sheer supply-demand relationships there, it's a very minimal pressure exerted by changing food demand, considering that the really diverse options for what we can do with those products. And that's the case for a lot of different agricultural products. So the idea that human food shifts are going to create some sort of centrally designed ideal food system, I don't think is feasible. I think that there's probably a lot of challenges with leveraging policy as a strategy to do that, which is where I get back to the solution of individual commodities and industries kind of working toward their own set of goals, which creates a disaggregated solution, which is never really all that ideal, but it's something that can be implemented today. And we see that within the US dairy industry, that they're making commitments and working toward objectives and implementing them today, as opposed to taking kind of decades or more to work toward actual implementation. There's a time clock here that we also need to be considering. And so rapidly implementable strategies are those where I find a lot of promise. That was a long tangent for that question. Hopefully I'm sorry about that.
Thanks, Robin. I'll just finish up. There's a comment that California is reducing its methane emissions from its dairy sector. I think we'll hear a lot about that next week. And Emmaus just wanted everybody to be aware that anyone interested in food security in the US can participate in a webinar next week. It's going to be on April the 26th from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. And if you want to register, there's a link in the Q&As. And so, Robin, I really want to thank you very much for your presentation and really interesting perspective. And I am always intrigued at looking at kind of optimizing spreadsheets for human nutrition and what if we were doing a least cost ration for ourselves, or what foods would get included. I think it's an interesting question.
I've definitely learned quite a lot by doing more interaction with the human nutrition sector. They take a very different view to nutrition than how we're trained as livestock nutritionists. So it's been a good mental exercise to kind of jump through those different ways of thinking.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Robin. I think we all got a lot out of your presentation. And thanks to everyone who joined today. We will be wrapping up our seminar series next week, where we will have, as alluded to, our own Frank Mitloner and Ermias Kabreb from our UC Davis campus to talk about improving the environmental performance of California's dairy industry. So we'll look forward to wrapping up our series with that. And for now, our dairy and our livestock program team members will hop over to our other link and continue the discussion on environmental stewardship as it relates to our industries. And we're going to talk about some manure management today. So look forward to seeing folks over there and everyone else next week. Thank you so much. Take care.